I don't know how well you can see that, but there are some leaves starting to change to their autumn colors there. Chlorophyll runs out, red, orange, yellow, less green in some of the spots. It's still overwhelmingly green, but there are some leaves starting to change. I don't know if my cell phone camera can pick it up very well, but there are leaves starting to change on this lake over here. And not so much straight across. But we're going to cover chapter 4 today in what would have been your textbook. And it follows mostly what's kind of going on in your online textbook here. And so we're starting right here, chapter 4. Don't forget, you can get this copy of notes that I have online. I'll try to put them in this week's weekly itinerary again, so you can have them and access them. But chapter 4, and there's a couple things we're going to skip because I've already made videos on the past, and I'll let you know when we get there. But the back country develops slowly. The back country, we're kind of a frontier country, especially in the colonial period. You have ports and some developments, but a lot of the people live in the back country, kind of like away from the ports. And because without modern transportation and highways and trains and planes, it doesn't take that far oftentimes to get into the wilderness, even from some of the bigger cities. And so kind of keep that in mind. And the back country slowly develops and kind of pushes in. And much of it's rural and much of it's kind of isolated, even as it pushes in deeper. German immigrants. A lot of the German immigrants that come here, they tend to move for religious reasons. Maybe they're escaping persecution in Germany for religious reasons. And so when they come here, they're not necessarily fleeing poverty, they're fleeing religious persecution. And so the fact of the matter is they oftentimes tended to have more wealth, and they could buy land near towns and buy land in the more eastern, more developed spots, where it's maybe a bit safer because you maybe have less Native American attacks in the east than you do in the back country. And so these German immigrants oftentimes tend to have occupations, middle-class type occupations, where they can get a good living here, or have some wealth to buy land and they can farm it well. Now the Irish immigrants, they're another big immigrant group that's kind of coming over in this time period outside of Britain, like the English and Scottish and Welsh. But the Irish, they tend to move to escape poverty. They're not doing well back in Ireland, and some of them are literally starving. And so when they come here, they don't have a lot of wealth, so they need to go where the land is cheap or even kind of free. And maybe not from the Native Americans' point of view, but from the Irish point of view, free. And so they tend to live in riskier areas, out in the west, out in the back country. We are more likely to have Native American conflict and attacks and be more isolated. And there's also a lot of rich Englishmen who bought land out west. But they bought so much land and they've never seen it all. And then to their horror, when they finally go visit the land years after they bought it to kind of go see what they bought, because they bought vast tracts of land, there's already all these Irish immigrants living on it, working on it. And they're kind of hard to kick off with the legal system back then. And that always doesn't work. The Transportation Act of 1718. England, Ireland, Scotland start sending convicts to America. Jails are expensive, and a lot of people are in jail for debts. Some of the people are dangerous convicts, but a lot of them are minor crimes like debt, and they're set out to, hey, get a second chance at life. Georgia's the most famous colony for this, taking a lot, but there's other colonies that take some of these people too. Native Americans, they get pushed westward as more and more Europeans come here. And it displaces other tribes. And so one tribe gets pushed to another tribes. And so it increases wars between the tribes. Sometimes, though, perhaps more positively, still bad because they're getting pushed off their initial land. But you get these multicultural tribes where multiple tribes merge together as one. And they have the culture and language kind of just blends from the two different tribes. So you do get like a variety of different circumstances at different times. kind of keep that in mind. Trade here, guys. Trade. There's a middle ground. Kind of like you have the eastern ports that are kind of established, and much of the eastern seaboard is still wilderness. But you have New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston. And those start to become very well established and very well protected from any types of attacks of Native Americans. But as the Europeans push westward and attack Native American lands, you kind of get this middle ground where it's kind of like half European, half Native American. So literally and figuratively, it's kind of like a middle ground. And natives, even that move out west, even Native Americans have been pushed westward forcefully by whites, they tend to still want to trade with whites. A lot of Native Americans still want to stay near whites to trade, to get tools, to get various things, and guns especially. But the fact of the matter is, we oftentimes see Native Americans as kind of like helpless victims, and they can't really do anything to help themselves. This isn't always true. You look at the Iroquois. The Iroquois were brilliant at playing the English and the French off one another. Hey, English, the French are giving us this. What can you give us if you want us to be an ally with you? The Iroquois, they were famous for being in upstate New York, but they spread into other areas too, including even Michigan in some cases and times. But the fact of the matter is the Iroquois tend to be between the English and the French, geographically speaking, and they were brilliant at playing one off of the other one. Native Americans were very dependent on European manufactured goods, and it breaks down their society because the chiefs would give them orders like, oh, do not trade with the whites, and the younger generations would do it anyways to get tools that could make fires easier, and so forth, and get knives and stuff like that, metal knives. And the older generations are complaining that the younger generations are losing Native American skills, and that it's putting their society at a disadvantage because they're reliant upon Europeans. And what are they going to do? If we can't make these ourselves, we're more reliant and dependent upon them. And that the hierarchy kind of breaks down because they'll come up with treaties with the Europeans, and the younger generation, I don't have to follow that treaty, and so forth. Germ warfare. You start to see examples of this. Now, disease would have came no matter what. Most of the disease spread just because people came here from different continents, bringing different diseases incidentally with them. But you start seeing specific examples of people purposefully spreading smallpox. And the Europeans didn't necessarily know exactly all the science we know behind smallpox today, but they did know that smallpox was contagious. If somebody had smallpox, if you put on their clothing, that you could get it too, and they're purposefully giving Native Americans smallpox, the clothing, infected by it. Horrific biological warfare. And think about how evil that is, because you're not just attacking warriors, you're attacking everyone, babies, toddlers, infants, children, elderly, and so forth. The British colonies, they're growing, but the population is still mostly rural. Now, it's politics, business is still dominated by the big port cities. Places like, New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, South Carolina. But the population's still rural. And small towns, small villages, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. These big port cities, the four I just mentioned, they dominate politics. They dominate trade. And the English, there's a huge English influence, especially on the wealthy. And people kind of prove they have wealth by buying English manufactured goods. That's one of the biggest things. And America does very little manufacturing. And we do some, but in the colonial period, it's very little manufacturing. It's not like World War II, where we're the world's biggest industrial power. We do it like a tiny bits of manufacturing during the colonial era, like rope making, ship making. But for the most part, England tries to make it so we don't have manufacturing. And to show you're wealthy, you buy English manufactured goods. And it's a big fashion statement. It's a big statement of wealth and power and influence. That, look, I can buy these English goods, English-made goods. And as the economy grows, so do imports from England. Because you have more middle-class people. These middle-class people want to prove that they are somebody, so they're buying English goods to show, look, I have a connection to England. Look, I can afford this. Look at me. Now, we will talk about the Enlightenment, but not really the Great Awakening, because I have a separate video on that. But the Enlightenment, it's this scientific age. It's this age of reason, this age of science. Ben Franklin is the embodiment of the Enlightenment in America. People say that the Enlightenment was stronger in Europe, and in some respects that really is true. But you could argue it has a bigger impact on us if you take the argument that we're the ones who make the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution during this era using Enlightenment ideas, and that's something that most of Europe doesn't really do. I mean, the French Revolution after us, kind of, but anyways. So the fact of the matter is, guys, you look at this Enlightenment era here, and look at this Enlightenment era here. Ben Franklin's the embodiment of it. You think about Ben Franklin. He's a scientist. He's an ambassador. He's a diplomat. He's an inventor. He's an author. He's a publicist. He's a publisher. He does all sorts of things. And he's like a jack of all trades, and he masters them all. So there's this saying, like, if you're a jack of all trades, you're a master of no trades. Well, that's absurd if you look at Ben Franklin. But he's widely regarded as a genius. Oh, and even though he is a genius, and I do think he was a genius, he was extremely intelligent. I don't think anyone can really say he wasn't intelligent. But he's still a man of his times with his own faults. What's an example of a man of his time with his own faults? Well, for example, we already talked about like German immigrants coming here. Ben Franklin was worried about German immigrants. They don't speak English. They don't have English customs. They don't have English culture. They'll never buy into this, what we've got going on here. And they'll never buy into like the slowly growth of democracy in America, because they're not from here. And Ben Franklin was worried that German immigrants would ruin America, and obviously that was absurd. But Ben Franklin's not the only person with similar mindsets over the eras. He's not the first or the last person to think like that. You could say there's still people kind of thinking similar ideas today. Government as a science, Enlightenment, you take scientific ideas, but you apply it to all things, including government, philosophy, and so forth. John Locke, his theories on natural law, unalienable rights, these various ideas are part of this Enlightenment, this age of reason, this age of science. And a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers talk, and now we could dispute this, but just hold on a second. A lot of these Enlightenment thinkers talk about how America has less social barriers because we don't have a monarchy. We don't have, we have a monarchy in the sense that you have, King George III over the ocean, but we don't have like the aristocracy. We don't have like, I'm a lord and I own tens of thousands of acres or square miles of land, at least not to the same extent back in Europe. And so that hard work equals success. And there is statistical evidence that especially the northeastern colonies and the northern colonies, and the middle colonies a little bit, far more compared to the south, but in the northern colonies there is evidence that people are able to work their way up the socioeconomic ladder and work their way into the middle class and work their way into the upper middle class. Ben Franklin's an example of this. He starts off poor. He's so rich. He's like, I don't need any more money. In fact, when Ben Franklin invents the lightning rod, which is still saving lives to this day, he says, I don't need to make any money off of it. I'm not going to make any money off of it. I already have enough. I already have enough money. Now, what are some examples how maybe this Enlightenment theory about the less social barriers is not true? Well, maybe it is true compared to Europe, but if I'm a slave, aren't there a lot of social barriers holding me back? And I could work really hard, but I'm not going to find a lot of success as a slave. Women, for example, you could make a similar argument to. So there still are social barriers, but Enlightenment thinkers are comparing America to Europe, and many even European Enlightenment thinkers are making this argument. America has less social barriers, so hard work equals success. The Great Awakening, I have a separate video about that, but one thing is, real quick, people start to think for themselves religiously. And some of these traveling preachers called itinerant preachers, and they say, think for yourself. Some don't even think for yourself. But you don't have TV, you don't have internet, you don't have radio. And so the net effect is most people only hear what their local church wants them to hear. And so the fact of the matter is people start to think for themselves, form their own churches. It democratizes churches. If I don't like my church, I can make my own. And what are you going to do about it? And so forth. And some people say it helps spur the American Revolution. How does this help spur the American Revolution? The king is the head, or today queen, but back then king. The king is the head of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and basically sets religious policies. Well, if I can question him on religion, why can't I question him on something less important, at least in the colonial mindset back then, less important on something like taxes, right? So the Great Awakening, and this is the first Great Awakening. There's a second Great Awakening right before the Civil War in the early 1800s. But the fact of the matter is, this leads to separation of church and state, because as there's more different types of churches, one church can't dominate the local state government. And it also helps lead to the American Revolution. A lot of people argue because you can question, and I start questioning, and I can even question the king on religion. Why can't I question him on some other things? In fact, the Presbyterians were one of the most famous groups for spurring forward the American Revolution. They'll go around saying, quote, "No king but King Jesus," in a lot of their activities. You can see the king wouldn't be very fond of that. Spain's empire was vast, but not very controllable. The Pueblo Revolt was in the readings, and you noticed in the readings, after the Pueblo Revolt, basically, Spain, they lightened up a lot because they didn't want it. If they figured if they were too strict, that people would rebel more. You can see the beautiful gray clouds up there in Michigan here today. But guys, most of the Spanish people who move here are men, priests, soldiers, and they have a lot of children with Native American women. These people are called mestizos, children of mixed race. Pure Spanish-bred people tend to be at the top of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Mestizos are somewhere in the middle, and the Native Americans are on the bottom. Now, they tended to live with natives, but they treat the natives as second-class citizens. I just said Native Americans are typically at the bottom of Spanish-American colonial societies. And the French and Indian War, which if you took AP European history with Dr. Dykhouse or read about world history, it's probably called the 7 Years' War. I have a separate video about that I'm going to include, so watch that too. So I won't go into too much detail here. But the Albany Plan is proposed by Ben Franklin. It's going to get rejected, but he says, look, we 13 colonies, we have to worry about attacks from France. We have to worry about attacks from Native Americans. We have to worry about attacks from Spain. So we all need to pool. He's not saying make 13 colonies into one. He's not saying the 13 colonies need to rebel and create an American Revolution. But he's saying all 13 colonies need to pool their resources together to make a defense, an all-for-one, one-for-all type of defense deal to protect themselves from the French, Spanish, Native Americans, and so forth. And it is rejected strongly in Britain. It's rejected as well here at home, but maybe not as strongly back in Britain. But the fact of the matter is, Ben Franklin, this is the first known time where people are saying the 13 colonies should at least kind of unify in their mutual self-interests. All right, kids, hey, stay positive. We can do this. Hey, contact me whenever you need help with an assignment or need help, or contact me if you just want somebody to talk to. We'll get through this COVID stuff. Before you know it, Monday, October 19, I'll be in first person lecturing with my yardstick. Heck yeah, guys. Stay out of trouble. Get your work done.